Hey, everybody, this is Josh for another episode of the podcast. I am very happy to be joined by Mike Tabor, founder of Moon River Software. Mike, thanks very much for coming on the show today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
My first question, as always, Mike, is can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and the business that you work on right now as well?
Sure. So I'll try to keep this short because I've done a lot of things over the years. I started out in 2005 or so. That was when I started my business and ended up going full time on it. So before that, I'd worked at a couple of different places. And during that time frame from 2005 on, I've done a lot of consulting, enterprise consulting for large companies, public ones that you'd probably hear of, like United Health Group, Pfizer, NASDAQ. I've done work for the Department of Defense, been flown around the world to do different things for them. And then since then, I also had started a company called Microconf and let's see here, Founder Cafe. Actually, at the time, it was called Micropreneur Academy. I co-founded both of those with a man by the name of Rob Walling, who was the founder of Drip. He also we've co-founded a couple of other companies as well. But anyway, the long story short there is really that right now I've been focused mostly on a product called BlueTick. I've been running that since about 2016, I believe. And it's mainly used for warm and cold email follow-ups.
Got it. And how did you kind of get into that line of business?
So for BlueTick itself, it was mainly a result of a problem that I'd had when I was doing outreach and doing enterprise sales. And the problem I ran into was that I would email people and I was trying to talk to people in IT departments or IT directors at that level to try and get in because it was compliance software that I was trying to sell. And the challenge was just I was not getting responses. And what I found was that going through and tracking everything on a spreadsheet and trying to go through this process of I send them an email and then I wait a little while and send another email and then wait a little while. Eventually they would get back to me, or sometimes there would be something very specific that I would say, like, for example, we have a new update and there's a new version of this product available. Would you like to check it out? And inevitably at some point in the future, they would turn around and come back to me. And so it was just a matter of either hitting them at the right time or just the repeated follow-ups and making sure that I was still there for the conversation. Then that would tend to provoke a response because those types of people are very busy, and answering an email for me was not on their top 5 list of priorities. And so BlueTick was really born out of that need to be able to do those follow-ups. And at the time, there were really no products out there that would allow you to do follow-ups from multiple email accounts. And so I built BlueTick basically specifically because I had that need for it. And I started asking around, went through this fairly lengthy validation process for both that and for another product that I bought a domain name for it, but it never really worked out because I didn't get the traction for that other product that I did for BlueTick. And so in the process of that, I went through and I did pre-sales. I gathered about $2,000 worth of pre-sales. And before I even wrote a single line of code for the product. And I use that as kind of my validation process to say, yes, I think that this is probably a real business. Let me go through and actually build something for it.
Right. And that's definitely a key that I've noticed over the years, both myself and from talking to people, is so many just jump into writing code without having validated first. So
Mm-hmm.
highly recommend following Mike's approach to that business. Now, Mike, obviously, since then, a lot has changed. The cold email landscape with tech products and stuff like that has gotten very busy. Can you
Mm-hmm.
talk to us a little bit about how's BlueTick going right now? How does the business look? And what do you think about the industry? Is this a space, a market that's going to continue to grow?
That's a tough question to answer. I mean, there's parts of the question that you just asked are easier to answer than others. And so in terms of where things are at right now, they're going okay, but they're not great. I agree that cold email is one of those things where I don't believe it's ever going to fully go away. But the problems that I see in the industry are generally things along the lines of people using stale or out of date information. AI can be helpful to some extent in terms of writing the emails and crafting them. But I think the more important part is targeting, and AI is not very good at that piece of it yet. If you start aggregating data about people or contacts from different sources, inevitably some of that data is going to be wrong. And so you and I actually chatted with you about this offline. One of the things that the software that you're using to do some of your outreach said that my business makes $7.6 million a year, which is completely wrong. It's totally not true at all. But when you start relying on that type of information to help drive your business, and there are egregious mistakes in those things, then your targeting ends up being wrong. And I think that in your case, it worked out just because I have previously been a podcaster. I understand the whole, impetus for reaching out to people who are knowledgeable about building businesses and having them on the show. But at the same time, if you're trying to build a business where you're targeting people and the data set that you're using is completely wrong, then it makes it a lot more difficult to get through, and your response rates are going to plummet, which can, and which after that can result in a lot of other problems where, your overall deliverability will drop. And because as a result of that, your response rate will drop, and your reputation online for the domains that you're using is also going to drop. And so there comes a tipping point where it's just not going to work for you anymore, or you have to dump all those domains and email addresses and essentially start over again.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you mentioned earlier about kind of the validation process. If there's somebody out there listening and they're looking to start a business of their own or build a product of their own, what would you say are 5 key steps someone should take to kind of replicate your success or something similar?
Yeah, so I think that so I went through as I said, this whole validation process. I actually wrote a book called The Single Founder Handbook, and I talked about the specific validation process that I went through. When I sold that book, I also included all this material about exactly what I went through to validate just the product itself and how to take pre-orders and things like that. But I think if you step back a little bit from that, the key piece that you have to start with is you have to identify a problem that people are actually willing to pay for. And I see a lot of people looking at building a product or a business around something that they see as a personal need and a personal problem. And I've done this myself. I'm not immune from this, so don't take this as gospel from somebody who has done everything right. But I've made enough mistakes to realize that there's things that I've done wrong and then learned from those mistakes and then translated them into successes. And one of those is to identify the problem that people are actually willing to pay for. And the reason I say willing to pay for is because you have to make absolutely certain that when they say they would pay for something, there's a difference between I would pay for that versus I will pay for that. Because if you're asking somebody for advice on what to build or how to build it or a problem to solve, most people are more than happy to give advice about just about anything, whether they're knowledgeable about it or not. But when you start diving into those details and you get to the part of the sales process where you are having those discussions and you say, yeah, I would pay for that. And then you ask them for a credit card and say, well, wait a second. I actually don't need that right now. Well, you just said you'd pay for it. Again, there's a difference between would pay for it and will pay for it. And so you have to verify those things up front. And those are a couple of key things that are very subtle, but you have to pay attention to them. Another thing that I would say is you have to find a reliable and repeatable sales channel. And so whether that is online ads or cold calling or, content creation, blogs, that sort of stuff, lead generation, there's a lot of ways to go about either, identifying who it is that you are supposed to be targeting and getting them as a customer and putting them through your sales funnel. But at the same time, you need to make sure that you can do that over and over again. Because if you can't, who's to say that the people that you've talked to so far or that you onboarded very early on and identified as having that problem that you're solving would actually is a process that you can find other people that do that. Maybe you just got lucky. And if you can't do that consistently, you're never going to grow the business. You're never going to build it into something that's going to financially work out for you. I also see a lot of people build stuff that are pet projects that they think is a problem. And most people are like, yeah, I don't care. I would never pay for that. So those are probably the first couple of things. Talking to people before you build something. You've mentioned yourself that people will write code before they actually have validated if there's a market there. It's kind of a classic mistake. And, again, I'm not immune to that. I've done that before myself. Your biggest competitor is typically a spreadsheet. And so if you are competing against people who just use spreadsheets, most of the time a spreadsheet can be translated into software and you create a business process out of it and offer that to people, and it makes their lives easier. Sometimes they don't care. Sometimes that spreadsheet really it's just not meaningful. It's not a barrier to them doing their job. Last couple of things, I'd say start small. Make sure to take pre-orders. if you can. Obviously, like there's certain situations I think that it probably isn't going to work as well. What I did was I said, if I'm taking a pre-order from you, this is essentially you putting your vote in to say that I'm actually going to build this and finish it and be able to deliver something to you. You can even do that for a SaaS product, which BlueTick is a SaaS product. And so I basically just I let them decide on what it was. That was another key piece of information that I learned through this process, was by allowing them to decide what the price was. When I did the pre-orders, I had a web page where they could just type in whatever amount of money they wanted and how many months they wanted to prepay for. And I got ranges from, I think, around $39 to $100 a month. And it was the average was right around $50 a month. So I essentially went with that pricing and I haven't changed it since. But that helps you to give you context, and it allows you to ask questions, because when people ask you how much your product is, you can tell them, but they're going to have these mental pricing anchors that you don't necessarily know about because you're still very early on in the business and in the process. And so asking them to give you a price and what it is worth to them gives you a better sense of where your pricing should actually be. And again, these are things that you can do before you even start writing code. I did these pre-orders based on mock-ups that I did, basically wireframes using a product called Balsamic Mockups. Fairly inexpensive product, less than $100, but I built out 30 or 40 pages of the application in this. And I showed that to people as a demonstration of, this is what it's going to look like when it's done, but is this something you'd be willing to pay for? And if so, how much? How valuable is it to your company? And using that information, it allows me to go through that validation process and identify whether or not at that price point, do I think I can reach enough people to build a profitable business out of it? Last thing I would say is, don't be afraid to push people to actually pay and put their credit card down, because that is the ultimate vote of confidence, is having a credit card number that somebody has said, yes, you can charge me for this. And even if you don't have the product yet, and you can make all sorts of personal guarantees, like I will refund your money if I don't deliver on this. I will, eat whatever the cost is, because the transaction costs are maybe 3% at most. And so even if you take $2,000 worth of pre-orders and you decide you're not going to do it and you refund all that money, you're out $60. It's not that big a deal, especially in comparison to being in a situation where you spend the next 3 to 5 years of your life working on something and it just never works out.
Definitely a relative small cost to, prove out or disprove an idea. So I think that's great advice. Mike, what would you say has been the hardest part of your entrepreneurial or even, more specifically, the solopreneur journey?
I would say probably the fact that it is solo. So there's a couple of different aspects of that. One is, if you're not working on any given day, nothing gets done. And you can use contractors and, part-time workers to some extent, but at the end of the day, they're mostly looking to you for direction, and you can trend towards a lot of micromanagement, which is not really the position you want to be in. And so that makes it difficult to run the business. But the other side of it that is also very difficult is the fact that you are working alone for the most part, and it can be very lonely. And so I recommend to virtually everyone who's starting a business on their own, find your people. There's mastermind groups out there. There's other people who are doing things similar to what you're doing online. You could talk to them, schedule weekly or monthly meetings, and online communities can help as well, especially since there are typically other people in those communities that can help guide you in the right direction. I mean, I started an online community, co-founded it with my partner, Rob Walling, back in the day. It was called the Micropreneur Academy. It has since undergone some transformations. It's now called Founder Cafe, and I operate that, myself without, Rob's involvement. But those online connections and people that you can talk to who are in similar situations are really going to help, because if you building a business and you start talking to your friends and family about it, they're really, really high that they have no idea what you're talking, simply cannot relate to what you're doing. And so that creates this sense of you're talking to them, but they don't really have any context for a conversation. Whereas the people who are online, who are actually doing it and have built businesses or have tried to, they have context for some of the challenges that you're running into, and they can give you some advice. They can tell you what things to avoid, what not to do, what things you should double down on, how you should look at things a little bit differently.
Absolutely. Definitely vouch for that. What would you say, Mike, as my last question, other than the topic that we just talked about? What would be your best piece of advice to someone, a solopreneur or an aspiring solopreneur who's listening to this right now? Obviously a broad question, but what would be your key piece of advice to them?
Again, it goes back to finding your people. I really think that that is the thing that separates the people who are successful versus who are not. I've talked to people who they will join mastermind groups and those cost $50,000 a year just to join. And some of them have requirements like you have to have at least $5 million or $10 million in revenue and, various other requirements. But there's a lot of just people who are online and trying different things. And you can learn a lot from those people and get perspectives that you would have no way of coming to on your own, especially given the fact that if you're not surrounding yourself with other people who are doing similar things and are knowledgeable about how you're doing them, you're not going to grow very well. And I mean that in both a business sense and a personal sense as a person, as the business owner. It's very difficult to know what to do when you have no context for it or no basis for it. And so if you're trying to figure things out, yeah, you can muddle through it. You can figure things out for the most part, but you're going to make a lot more mistakes along the way than if you had sounding boards that you could leverage to kind of guide you in the right direction.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm part of a mastermind right now as well. And part of it is like, help with your business. And like you said, kind of like having conversations with people who can relate to you. Part of it is just a breath of fresh air every 2 weeks to like surround yourself with those people and talk about, problems that, you can all relate to. So definitely a big thumbs up to that piece. Mike, want to thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been very, very insightful. If people want to learn more about your businesses or get in touch with you, where do you recommend that they go?
Sure. So I have a couple of different products and websites that I operate. Moonriversoftware.com is I wouldn't even recommend people look for that. But again, I would say go to bluetick.io, foundercafe.com, or there's a new product I'm working on called Inbox Fusion. That'll be at inboxfusion.com when it's ready. You can also find me on Twitter. My handle is @singlefounder. And the other way to find me is probably just pull up Google and search for Mike Tabor. There's a handful of us out there, but apparently I have the largest presence on the internet.
Awesome, Mike. Thank you again for coming on the show. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.